So, we are going to stop between 10:02 and 5:02 just to get you on to your next appointments. If you need to leave, just get up and leave. But otherwise, that's my goal of when to stop. As you can see, I did part 1 and part 2 because I've learned from these that 50 minutes is not a lot of time, and all of a sudden you're pressed for time. So, Achenbach has a lot of good information. Both clinical utility, you got the preschool, you got the school age. So my goal today is to get through just a little background about the acebas, how we use them here, how you could use them more, like clinical utility, how they're used for the testing, a little bit on normative data. I'm not going to get too deep into that because statistics really just wasn't my favorite thing to do at school anyway, and that's what we have the manual for. So if you want to take a deep dive into how the items were analyzed, how they were factor analyzed, what statistical methods they used, you are free to look at our manuals here. I will just do a broad surface of sample size and what they used and how they used. And, when you look at those scales, what that's being compared to, right? Because sometimes rating scales are compared to a clinical sample and sometimes they're compared to a normative or healthy sample. It's always good to know those things. So I think you'll go away, learning a little bit more than you did know about these scales. So my goal is to get past that and then into the preschool forms and show you an example of a printout and look at that more closely. And then part 2 will be looking at the school age ones. All right, those are the ones that we use primarily because just that age group comes to us more. And that one has the parent forms, the teacher forms, and the use self-report form if they're old enough, 11 to 18. So there's a little more information there. Some of the scales are the same as the preschool one, so there'll be some overlap. I won't redo that part, but I will add on the syndrome scales and the DSM scales that are different, because that'll be important. And then we can even do kind of like a case example too. So keep in mind, if you have one of these that you've given to parents, teachers, the youth, and it seems like a really interesting one, put it to the side and then bring it in November, or send me a little email so that, we can look at it and we can kind of go over that together. Because one of the things that is cool about the rating scales is that you get different perspectives. You may get more than one parent, you may get more than one teacher, and you may get the youth. So it's kind of like grist for the mill for a therapy session too, right? To go over what's similar, what's different, why, are you different in different environments, what's pulling it. So a lot of good material that could be used in therapy sessions that way. And the scales provide measures of competence and adaptive functioning as well. And there's a place for parents and teachers to write in best things about the child. Right? Isn't it sad when it's not filled in? But when it is filled in, right? It tells us something if it's not filled in, but it also tells us a lot if it's filled in, because we all like to use strength-based kind of approaches, and it's like, hey, even though this is problem-oriented, you've got these strengths, and we're going to work with these. So, got nice tools there. All right, so I think what we'll do is, if you have a question, just ask it. I may address it a little bit later in the presentation, but it's probably better just to bring it up right away. Right? If I don't know something, I'm fine saying I don't know it, and you can either look it up in the manual. I don't really get into process stuff too much. So one of your handouts is fresh off the printer from Heather, and it is a process kind of thing that we'll look at. I'll talk about that in a little bit. But this is mostly content. mostly, clinical content about the scales. And the process will be done at another meeting or something like that. But and if you have questions about process, you can ask Heather, or you can ask Jillian, or your colleagues about like how to get them, how to send them out, those kind of things. All right. So apparently my pointer up here works for forward, but it doesn't work back. If you have a question about a previous screen, we all have the printouts, so we can look at that. But I'd have to run back there to make it go back. So we'll just keep going forward. All right, just keep in mind, part 2 is in November. So we'll see you then for that. All right. The Achenbachs, I've always called them Achenbachs. Some people call them CBCLs. Some people call them ACEBAs. So they go by different names. But the ACEBA is the Achenbach, right? And it is the empirically based assessment. So that's why you'll see different terms. CBCL stands for Child Behavior Symptom Checklist. Any of those terms are fine. It is a system, an integrated system, so you're getting more than one rating. It is norm-based, which means it has good psychometric properties behind it about how the items were developed. It has areas of weakness too, like any rating scale, right? You can get rater bias, response bias in teachers, in all of us. Sometimes kids who fill it out want to look good, right? Sometimes parents who fill it out want you to know they need a lot of help. And so you might get that floating profile. So there's some bias in any rating scale. But it is norm-based, and we'll talk about the norms in a little bit detail later on. It can collect information about clients who range in age from 1.5 to 18, so that's our group right now. There are adult forms, so I mean, if you ever kind of service adults, there are forms for adults as well. They're used in different environments. School systems will use these, or the BASC, which is similar, Behavioral Assessment System for Children. So they're used in there. They're used some pediatric medical clinics use them as well. So little different environments there. The forms can be completed by parents, teachers or caregivers, and the client. And it's used as a clinical tool here at Catalpa. It's our kind of go-to, our primary one. Everybody else may have some of their favorites, right? Some people use we have our suicide screens or our depression or anxiety screens, and those are good too. But these are used in all of our clinics here. And the other reason to use it is when you're referring for psychological testing, it is a required component because it tells us a lot of information that can allow us to accept that referral for testing or know that something else needs to be done before we might see them for testing. So it's a good tool for our psychology pool to use as well. All right, let's go on to our next screen. So why do we use them, right? Clinical utility. Well, it's going to assess a number of things. It's going to assess their competencies, some adaptive functioning, and problems. All right, so a big thing is problem-based in a relatively easy and cost-effective manner. Cost-effective is relative, but given the fact that we're getting so much information from teachers, different parents, and the youth, it really does tend to be a cost-effective way. Especially if you want input from teachers, you know how it is to try to get back to a teacher who's called you. They're not available, you're not available, right? You want some information about that child. They can give you that information. And not only rating the problem items, but there's places to write. There's open-ended type of places to write. So it can give a lot of nice information that way. You can quickly obtain standardized data, so it is standardized. It's objective in the sense of how it's scored. It's subjective in the sense of how, it's rated, because it's all based on the perspective of the person doing it. Broad spectrum of issues. Usually takes about 15 to 20 minutes to complete, and it requires a 5th grade reading level. Once in a while, I've had a parent who I suspect maybe can't fill it out. Usually we're giving it to them to take home to complete, so they can usually get somebody to help them if they can't read that. If you happen to do one in your office, usually the best way is to give them a copy of it, and then you take a copy of it, and you tell them you'll read the item, and they'll tell you whether that's not true, somewhat true, or very true, and you can just mark it down, right, and then turn it in. But usually they'll find a way to do that. And we have English and Spanish versions available here. It does translate into many other languages. I think they translate it or give you the forms in Russian or whatever other language for a fee. So I don't really know what the fee is. We just tend not to use them when we have other languages. Has anybody used another language one on this one? Behavioral and emotional problems that often arise if the child has some of those language delays. And those are good to pick up on. And then, do some accommodations or therapy with more hands-on, play-based, visual type of things. Conversely, if a child comes in with behavior and emotional problems, very dysregulated, that can interfere with learning language. So you have some delays both ways. So the scoring is for the average length of phrases. That's why the parent is asked to put in an example of the phrase that the child says. And then the vocabulary. All right, so you can eyeball those certainly. Sometimes it's helpful to print out one of those early development things from American Academy of Pediatrics, for example. Sometimes good speech pathologist websites have that too. So you'll know that if, let's say you're getting a 2-year-old, right? You can just kind of print something out about average language development for 2-year-olds, kind of where they should be. And then you'll know we're 3-year-olds, and you can tell the parent that. If you know it already, you don't need to print it out, but sometimes that's good to have for reference. All right, any questions on the parent preschool form? Great. Let's go to the preschool form for the caregiver or teacher. And that is green in color, and it's the next one after the language, the vocabulary one in your handout. All right. One page. Yeah, one page. So it has some things that are similar. It has some things that are different, of course, as well. So who can complete that? Daycare providers, teachers, if they're in like early childhood, birth to 3, could complete that. But usually we like it if the child's seen in a group setting. So the best, what it's normed on, are daycare and school settings. Many times I get speech therapists who fill that out. Usually it's in a one-on-one setting, so I have to take that into account because the speech pathologist assessment often shows less problems. I mean, if it shows more than that, I think that's significant. But most kids will do better in that one-on-one kind of structured setting that way. So just know that that's the way that it was normed. It was on who see the child in a group of at least 4 children. So it provides information about, on the form here, the teacher is asked, or the daycare provider, whoever's filling this out, is asked to provide what role they have. That's important, what role. The average number of children that are in the class, how many hours per week they spend at the facility, how many months have you known the child. I think that's important, especially with school starting here in September next month. We may get some of these forms completed by a teacher who's only known the child for a couple weeks. We don't like to do that. We like to wait. At least have them have a month. 2 months is ideal, but at least a month. Because if they don't know them well, you might not get that good. You might get a honeymoon kind of period, or they just might not know them well. So it's good to look at that to see if they check not well or very well or moderately well, how long they've known the child. And the number of kids in the class is important too. I just had a 3-year-old who was at the Y facility, and we're trying to figure out why his behavior was really off the wall in that setting. Well, it turns out that he wasn't in the type of classroom I was thinking he was in. Now, it was a summary eval, so I didn't have this from the teacher. I had Mom talking, and talked a little bit more about that. And he was in just one of those drop-off kind of things where there's like 30 kids, and he couldn't handle it. He was just overwhelmed, overstimulated. And I said, well, what about the smaller classroom setting? And she said, it costs more money. So we went through the pros and cons of that. I think she asked Dad to pitch in a little bit, and they put him in the other classroom, and behaviors improved a lot. So, you got to look at that. Some of the kids just don't do well in that huge setting there. All right, so many of the same problem items that are on the parent checklist are on this one, but it substitutes items relevant to group situations. And this one does say within the past 2 months. So now or within the past 2 months. And again, the directions are the same there. Please answer all items as well as you can, even if some do not seem to apply to the child. And it also tells the teacher here how this might be helpful, right? Please fill out this form to reflect your view of the child's behavior, even if other people might not agree. Feel free to write additional comments besides each item, and in the space provided on page 2, be sure to answer all items. All right. 99 problem items. The 100th one is write any additional ones. Same 3 kind of questions there about any illness or disability. What concerns you most? Please describe the best things about the child. There is not a language development survey on the teacher one. That is only on the parent one. So that's a big difference there. That was the copy. All right. Now let's just talk briefly about how the test was developed. Because it has different age groups, and when we get to the 6 to 18-year-old, you'll see that they actually split those up into 2 different age groups too, because that's such a wide span. But the 1.5 to 5-year-olds, what went into analyzing the factor analysis for the test items. It was a pretty lengthy process from what I read about the facilities. It was a national survey, and in here it talks about how many from the Midwest, what percentage are from the South, the North, so they tried to get all areas. When they were doing the factor analysis for the items, they used general population. They also used special education settings, preschool environments, and different clinical settings. All right, so a lot of outpatient mental health clinics were used as well to determine what items differentiated between kids who were referred versus who were not referred. Right, so had problems versus kids who didn't have problems. All right, so that's how they did the item analysis. When it came to the normative data part, how we were going to compare what we get here to what sample, that is a healthy sample. So they took out all of the special ed and the clinical ones now for this normative sample, because when we do this, we're looking at these problem items compared to kids who haven't been referred. And they had a good sample size. They had 700 kids in the parent, the CBCL group, and they had a little over 1,100 kids in the teacher group. No gender differences were found for the parent one. Slight or significant gender differences, so between boys and girls, were found on the teacher one. So, that just tells them when they're developing these, can they put all the kids together in the normative, in the group when we do this, or do we have to split them out? And so the program does that automatically. If there are significant gender differences and your patient is a boy, then he will be compared to boys. All right. If there are no gender differences, he's going to be compared to that sample of kids in that age group mixed. All right. So sometimes on the printout, you will see syndrome scale for boys or syndrome scale for girls. And other times you want to just say syndrome scale. So that kind of tells you there whether it's the mixed gender or it's split. Boys 604 girls, so relatively equal there. If you take a little deeper dive into the normative data, you'll see that mothers completed the forms significantly more than fathers, which may be true in our environment as well. But there was a little bit higher than most people like to see of people who are higher in socioeconomic status, which I think we tend to equal out a bit. And since we take, MA, we tend to see people who are lower on socioeconomic status. So a little bit difference there. Don't know what difference that makes, but we just have to keep some of those things in mind with limitations. So the preschool test development came up with, after all they did all these factor analysis with the items, 6 syndrome scales. When they refer to syndrome scales, they think of a syndrome as a group of related problems. So they try to put the ones that loaded on hyperactivity kind of all together. What else went with that? Because sometimes, you look at the scale and you say, oh, they put sleep problems under that, or, oh, they put, some other thing under that. Well, it's because that's how the item analysis loaded on that. It might not look like it belongs there, but it belonged there statistically. 6 syndrome scales for both of these preschool forms, except for the parent who has an extra one, and that's with sleep. All right, so that's what we have there. Let's look at those. All right. Now, it might help to look at your next page in this handout. That's the child behavior checklist for the 1.5 to 5-year-old syndrome scale for boys, it says on top. This is not a real patient. This comes from the ACEBA website, which has some samples. All right, so we don't have to blacken anything out, or just don't worry about that. It's not a real patient. All right, so Kenny is 30 months, and his mother completed this form. And so we have 7 syndrome scales because we have that extra sleep one that's on the parent one. So we have emotionally reactive. Oh, and one other thing too is that since the manuals came out, changes are being made to the test scores on an ongoing basis, especially since the shift of DSM-4 to DSM-5 came, because the DSM scales were based on DSM-4. Not that there's huge differences, but there's some, and so you may see a scale named a little bit differently. So affective problems, for example, on the I think a DSM might be depressive symptoms or depressive problems. Pervasive developmental problems might be autism spectrum problems. So you might see just a little different wording. And I tried to put that in the slide presentation here if I caught some of those. But I did check with Jillian just to make sure we have the latest form of the computerized testing. So she's going to double check, and we think we do. All right. So emotionally reactive. High score suggests a child who might be disturbed by change, changes in transition. They tend to be moody, sulky, whiny, worrisome. They shift between sadness and excitement. So those are the items that are on that scale. Anxious, depressed. A lot of these have face validity, right? You can look at them and say, oh yeah, they should go under that. But high score suggests a child who is fearful, clinging, upset, with separation, more self-conscious. They may look unhappy. And they're more emotionally sensitive to their feelings being hurt. That's what's on that one. Somatic complaints are a lot of physical type of complaints, headaches, eating problems, nausea, stomach aches, and obsessive compulsive symptoms are in there as well, being too neat. So there's one, right? Go figure under somatic. But I think that it probably picked up on the anxiety without loading real heavily on the anxiety one. So it fit under somatic complaints. All right. Withdrawn. Here you have somebody who, a child who might avoid eye contact, maybe unresponsive or less responsive to affection, show little interest in others or in things that kids should have interest in, like maybe opening a present for their birthday, something like that. They appear withdrawn. They might not answer when you call their name or ask them a question. They act younger and more mature and seem lost in their daydreams. All right. Then we have aggressive behavior. And that child, if they're high on those scores, may be defiant, easily frustrated, disobedient, destroys property, angry moods, fighting, screaming, impatient, lacks skill, cruel to animals. All right. So, and then the sleep problems was only on the parent one. Any type of sleep disturbance, trouble falling asleep, trouble staying asleep, crying during their sleep, nightmares, night terrors, right? Resists going to bed, or doesn't want to sleep alone. Then, in addition to those problem items that are put on the syndrome scales, that are the ones that go together, we have the problems can also be viewed from a diagnostic perspective. And so they put that under the DSM-4 at the time that it was developed, from the perspective of a diagnostic system. Not to replace good clinical judgment, right? You don't want to rely on the test to say that they have autism or they have anxiety, but they have problems under that could go along with a DSM. You just have to look at the criteria. Make sure you have the time frame, make sure they meet all the criteria, of course, for DSM before you give that diagnosis. So these scales that are on the DSM now, oriented ones, were not developed from factor analysis, but rather they took experienced psychologists and psychiatrists who judged the items to be consistent with a DSM-4 diagnostic category. So generalized anxiety, oppositional defiance, ADHD, and so on. And then they did their statistical analyses and ran all the things and came up with the 5 DSM-oriented scales that were developed. And just keep in mind, not equivalent to a DSM diagnosis, like I said. So we have affective problems, which I've seen also print out as depressive problems. All right, so that's your emotional mood kind of issues there. Then sleep, unhappy, anhedonia, lack of interest in or pleasure in things that they once found pleasure in, are under there. The second one, anxiety problems. Separation fears, generally fearful, excessive worry, nervous, clinging, doesn't want to sleep alone. 3, pervasive developmental problems. That's the title on here. I've seen it print out as autism spectrum problems. I would prefer that it printed out as pervasive developmental problems because parents see autism Like, sometimes it fits, sometimes it doesn't fit. You know, a lot of times it's pulling on other factors. Even kids with ADHD, when they're really young like this, or the real dysregulated kids, or somebody has a speech and language disorder, can pop up on the pervasive developmental problems. But eye contact problems, afraid to try new things, difficulty with change and transition, unresponsive to affection, speech problems. Physical mannerisms are also on there. We don't know what that is, if it's the stimming kind of thing, a stereotypic kind of behavior, or a tic. That's for us to further look at. ADHD, classic kind of features. We'll talk a little bit more in November about the ADHD scale, because for the older kids, it loads more heavily on hyperactivity. But there is a way that you can find on the teacher scale how it's kind of parsed out between inattentive symptoms versus hyperactive impulsive. So you can actually look at that to help you out with that differential there. But demands must be met immediately. They struggle with attention and all those self-regulation kind of issues. And then the oppositional defiant, the stubborn, uncooperative, angry mood kind of child. So those were the syndrome and the DSM scales. And then the other one that the printout gives us is the internalizing, externalizing, and total problems. So that's in the middle of those two. And very good, we are running on time, so I'm going to be wrapping things up here. So internalizing problems, all right? The things that come from within the self, such as emotional reactivity, depression, anxiety, medical or somatic complaints without no medical cause, withdrawal from social contacts. And then you have the externalizing problems, and that's conflicts with other people. That's on the next slide. But conflicts with other people and with their expectations for children's behavior. So they're the kids who act out. So the syndrome scales are grouped according to how they loaded on the internalizing scale. So when you look at the syndrome scales, then you have emotionally reactive, anxious, depressed as the top two. Those are the ones that loaded most heavily on the internalizing problems. And then it kind of goes that way, with the last two being externalizing, all right? And on some of the printouts, it will even say, these are the internalizing factors, these are the externalizing factors. The sleep problems did not load on either one, so it's not listed in there. All right. Yeah, that makes sense now, as we look at that. And then the total problems. Right? You have internalizing, externalizing, and total problems, and that is just what it says there, that the number of problem items, the sum of all the problem items that were endorsed on the form is listed under that. Total problems really differentiates between those who are referred for special ed, like an EBD, and a mental health clinic, from those who are not referred. And then for the other problem areas, you can look in that little box as well. It lists some things. And if something is really of clinical significance, you know, there'll be a little star, there'll be a little letter next to that. And you can look at that a little more closely. 6 to 18-year-olds have things about suicide, for example. Those are one of those starred ones that we'll talk about next time. So since there are more problem items on these three scales than all the other syndrome scales, they had to do some adjustment statistically. And so I don't know if you've noticed, but when we talk about where a borderline in the clinical range is, this one drops down now to T-scores of 60 to 65 because they had to adjust for all the scores that were there, and in their sample size, even kids who were in that normative healthy sample scored some on here, so they had to lower that. For each of the syndromes are summed, and then they're converted to T-scores on here, T-scores and percentile ranks. If it's in the clinical range, it'll say a C next to it, so it'll help you there, but that's, you know, anything above that second dotted line. Anything within the dotted line is borderline clinical. You know, not enough to reach clinical, but still an at-risk problem area. So most of them have 65 to 69 for the T-scores. Those are the syndrome and the diagnostic ones as being in that borderline clinical range. Anything above 70 is in the clinical range. But just note that when you look at the internalizing and externalizing, it's just a little bit different there. You get a B, you get a C for borderline and clinical. Oh, stop! Part 2! Part 2 to come in November. All right, good timing. Anybody have a couple of quick questions? Yes?
So when you're explaining to parents the syndrome and the DSM, and when you talk about the syndrome with the physical-related problems and the internalizing to externalizing, but they often seem so similar to families when they're looking at it. How would you explain the difference between the syndrome scales and the DSM when you're showing them the graphs?
When you're showing them the graphs?
Or do you just show one of them?
No, I tend to show both. I mean, once in a while I've just showed one, but with time and stuff, so sometimes we'll go right to the DSM or right to the other one. I guess I would tell them that the syndrome scales are those problem items, and those are the items that the test developed. You don't have to go into that detail. Just tell them that those are the items that group together in problem areas. The next page are the ones that professionals rated that go under certain diagnostic groups that help us when we make diagnostic impressions, and what help us when we make diagnoses. They don't necessarily correspond to the diagnosis that your child has, but they help me in saying anxiety is probably something we should look at if that's one of the scales that are way up there. And same with the attention deficit. These are the areas we should look at in addition to what you've told me here. So that's what I would say. Is that it's problem focused, grouped together by similar problems versus professionals now have rated these into different diagnostic areas to help us on the diagnostic level. And we can look more at that next time when we look at the 6 to 18-year-olds, maybe how to give some of that feedback. Yeah, good question. Anything else? All right. Jot your questions down because part 2 will be here in November.